The grand bonding hall of Sevranthos had not seen such a gathering in over 100 years, and every seat in the enormous chamber was filled with the most powerful beings in the known galaxy. Princess Empress Velithra Kinceros stood at the center of the hall, her tall bioluminescent body glowing with soft violet light that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. And she kept her chin high, even though her stomach was turning with nerves she would never allow anyone to see. This was her day, the day that would decide her future, the day the soul flame would choose her bonded partner and seal her path to the throne of the Ascendari Empire. The Ascendari were the oldest and most powerful civilization in the galaxy, beings of immense psychic ability, who towered over most other species at nearly 9 feet tall, and their empire had ruled known space for 12,000 years without serious challenge. Every Ascendari royal who wished to claim the throne had to undergo the bonding ceremony, a sacred ritual in which the ancient soul flame, a living artifact older than the empire itself, would reach out across the galaxy and select the perfect warrior to bond with the royal heir. The bond was psychic, permanent, and powerful beyond measure, linking two minds together and amplifying the abilities of both partners far beyond what either could achieve alone. Velithra had prepared for this moment her entire life, and she had every reason to expect greatness. For her mother, the reigning Empress, had bonded with a Draken Berserker, a 12-foot mountain of muscle and fury that had helped her conquer 3 star systems, and her grandmother before that had bonded with a Thalvori Scion, whose telekinetic powers could crack a warship in half. These were the apex species of the galaxy, ranked at Tier 1 and Tier 2 on the Imperial Classification Index, and every royal bond in recorded history had drawn from these elite ranks. Burned at the center of the hall, a column of white gold fire that reached from floor to ceiling, and hummed with a sound that vibrated in the bones of every being present. And when Velithra stepped forward and placed her hands into its light, the entire hall held its breath. The flames surged, and Velithra felt it race through her mind like a river of warm light, searching, seeking, reaching across the stars for the one being in all the galaxy that was meant to be hers. She waited for the roar of a Draken mind, or the crystalline hum of a Thalvori consciousness, or even the deep, steady pulse of a Korvathi battle sage. What she felt instead was something so faint, so impossibly quiet, that she thought the flame had simply failed. The great doors of the hall opened, and 4 Imperial guards walked in, dragging a figure between them. A figure so small, compared to everyone else in the room, that several members of the court actually leaned forward in confusion. The creature was barely 6 feet tall, with dull skin that did not glow, short-cropped dark hair matted with dried blood, and a pair of hard brown eyes that swept the enormous hall with absolutely no sign of fear or awe. He wore the torn remnants of a military uniform that no one in the court recognized, and his wrists were bound in energy shackles that hummed against his skin, and there was a cut above his left eye that had only half stopped bleeding. Captain Ethan Mercer of the United Earth Defense Force had been captured 3 weeks ago during a skirmish on a frontier world called Cathara 7, where a small human scouting force had stumbled into Ascendari territory and been swiftly overwhelmed. He had killed 11 Ascendari soldiers before they finally brought him down, which was a fact that had been quietly removed from the official report, because no one wanted to admit that a Tier 9 species could do such a thing. The court announcer, a Ascendari with deep blue bioluminescence, stared at his data tablet for a long moment, before speaking in a voice that cracked with disbelief. The soul flame has chosen, and the bond is declared. The partner of Princess Empress Velithra Kinceros is a human male, species classification Tier 9, from the planet designated Earth. Silence filled the hall, and it was not the respectful silence of awe, but the terrible silence of shock and barely contained horror. Then the whispers began, and they spread through the court like poison. "A human," someone hissed from the upper galleries. "She has been bonded to a human." "Tier 9, another voice said with open disgust. "They are barely above animals." "The succession is finished," a third voice declared flatly. "No heir has ever ascended with a Tier 9 bond, and none ever will." Velithra felt the blood drain from her face, even as her bioluminescence flickered with the effort of maintaining her composure. She looked at this human, this small battered creature that the most sacred artifact in her civilization had chosen for her, and she felt something she had never felt before in her life. She felt shame. Across the hall, Prince Solvan Quinteros, her cousin and chief rival for the throne, leaned back in his seat with a smile spreading across his angular face like a blade, and his bonded partner, a massive Draken berserker named Hrothgar, who stood behind his chair like a living mountain, rumbled with low amusement. "How unfortunate," Solvan said, loud enough for the entire front row to hear. "I had such hopes for my dear cousin." Velithra's mother, Empress Selithara, sat upon the elevated throne at the head of the hall, and looked down at the scene with an expression that was worse than anger, worse than disappointment. It was the cold, calculating look of a ruler reassessing a political asset that had just lost all its value. But sacred law was sacred law, and the soul flame had never been wrong in 12,000 years, and so the ritual had to be completed. Velithra walked toward Ethan on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and when she reached him, she had to look down to meet his eyes, because he was so much shorter than her. And what she saw in those brown eyes stopped her for just a moment. There was no submission there, no gratitude, no awe, and no fear. There was only a hard, steady defiance that said very clearly that this human did not care who she was or how powerful her empire might be. "I do not know what this is," Ethan said in a low, rough voice, speaking the galactic common tongue with a heavy accent that told her he had learned it recently, and probably under difficult circumstances. "But I am not anyone's property." "You do not have a choice," Velithra replied, and she hated how hollow her own voice sounded. "And neither do I." She placed her hand on his forehead, as the ritual required, and the soul flame surged one final time, and the bond snapped into place between them, like a chain made of light. Velithra reached out through the new connection, expecting to feel the raw power that every royal before her had described, the overwhelming flood of their partner's strength and mind merging with their own. Instead, she felt almost nothing. A whisper where there should have been a roar, a thin thread of connection where there should have been a river, and she nearly staggered with the disappointment of it. What she did not know, what she could not possibly have known, was that on the other side of that bond, Ethan Mercer had felt the connection slam into him like a freight train, and in the span of a single heartbeat, he had done what humans had been doing since they first learned to survive on their brutal home world. He had assessed the threat, locked down his emotions, and built a wall. The bond was not weak because Ethan was weak, and the bond was not thin because humans were lesser beings. And the truth was so much more dangerous and so much more wonderful than anyone in that hall could have imagined. The truth was that Ethan Mercer was holding back the full weight of a human mind behind a barrier of iron will, because he was a prisoner in enemy territory, and he was not about to give these towering, glowing aliens access to everything he was. He looked up at Velithra with those hard brown eyes and said nothing. And the Princess Empress looked back down at him and saw nothing but a weak little creature from a weak little world. They were both wrong about each other, and the galaxy itself would tremble before they discovered just how wrong they had been. 3 weeks had passed since the bonding ceremony, and Velithra had spent every single day wishing the soul flame had chosen anyone else in the entire galaxy. Ethan Mercer had been given quarters in the eastern wing of the Imperial Palace, a set of rooms that were considered modest by Ascendari standards, but were larger than any home he had ever lived in on Earth. And he had immediately rearranged all the furniture to create clear sightlines to every door and window, because that was simply what humans did when they entered a new space. He was required to train with Velithra every day in the palace training grounds, to strengthen their bond before the Ascension trials, the deadly series of challenges that every heir had to survive alongside their bonded partner. And these training sessions had become the most humiliating part of Velithra's already humiliating situation. The training grounds were open to the court, which meant that every noble, every rival, and every seminar, every gossip-hungry official could watch the Princess Empress and her human stumble through exercises that other bonded pairs completed with ease. On the first day of combat training, the weapons master paired Ethan against a Korvathi soldier, a broad-shouldered reptilian being with 4 arms and scales that could turn a blade. And the Korvathi had thrown Ethan across the room so hard that he hit the far wall and left a crack in the stone. Velithra had closed her eyes in embarrassment, and when she opened them, she saw Ethan getting back to his feet with blood running from his nose, and that same hard expression on his face, as if being thrown into a wall was simply an inconvenience. He fought the Korvathi again, and lost again. And then he fought it a 3rd time, and lost a 3rd time, and by the 4th bout something strange had happened. Ethan did not win the 4th bout, but he lasted 3 times longer than the 1st, and the Korvathi had to actually work to bring him down. And the 5th bout lasted longer still, and by the end of the 1st week, something had changed that made the weapons master go very quiet. Ethan had started winning, not through strength, because he would never be as strong as a Korvathi, and not through speed, because several species in the training grounds were faster than any human could ever be, but through something that none of them had a word for, and that Ethan simply called learning. He watched his opponents with those steady brown eyes, and he remembered everything, every habit, every pattern, every tiny tell that preceded an attack, and he adapted his approach so quickly and so completely that no opponent who beat him once could ever beat him the same way again. The Korvathi who had thrown him into a wall on the 1st day found itself on the ground by the 2nd week, locked in a chokehold that no species in the galaxy had ever seen before, because humans had spent thousands of years developing ways to defeat larger and stronger opponents using nothing but leverage and technique. The weapons master, an old Ascendari veteran named Kale, who had trained bonded pairs for 60 years, pulled Velithra aside after training one evening with a troubled expression. "Your human is not what I expected," he said carefully. "He is adequate," Velithra replied, because admitting anything more felt like accepting her situation. "He is not adequate," Kale said firmly. "He is something I have never seen before, and I have trained Draken Berserkers and Thalvori Scions, and none of them have ever learned as fast as this creature learns." Velithra said nothing, but she began to watch Ethan more carefully after that. She noticed that during the endurance exercises that were part of their training, the other bonded warriors would reach their limits and collapse after several hours of sustained effort. But Ethan simply kept going and going and going. Body did not understand the concept of stopping. When she asked the palace physician about this, the old doctor had pulled up the biological file on humans and read through it with growing unease. "Their species evolved as persistent predators," the physician told her in a voice that held a note of horror that seemed out of place in a medical briefing. "They did not hunt by being faster or stronger than their prey, but by simply following it until it collapsed from exhaustion, sometimes for days without stopping, and their bodies are designed to sustain damage and keep functioning in ways that frankly disturb me." "What do you mean?" Velithra asked. "I mean that I treated him for 3 cracked ribs after yesterday's training session, and he did not tell anyone about them," the physician said. "He had been fighting with cracked ribs for 2 days, and when I asked him why he had not reported the injury, he looked at me as if I had asked a stupid question, and said that they were not that bad. Cracked ribs are not that bad," Velithra repeated flatly. Not to a human, apparently, the physician replied, and she could hear the discomfort in his voice. The more Veilithra watched, the more she noticed, and the more she noticed, the less certain she became about everything she had been taught regarding species classification. Ethan required only 4 hours of sleep each night, while every other species in the training program needed at least 8. And he used those extra hours to study, reading everything he could find about Ascendari military tactics, history, and technology, with a hunger for knowledge that seemed almost desperate. She found him one night in the palace library at an hour when no sane being should be awake, surrounded by holographic displays showing schematics for Ascendari shield technology. And when she asked him what he was doing, he simply said, "Understanding your systems," as if that explained everything. It was during the 4th week that everything changed. They were practicing the psychic synchronization exercises that were essential for the Ascension trials. Exercises that required both partners to open the bond fully and merge their awareness. And every day, Veilithra had pushed against that thin, quiet thread of connection and felt almost nothing from Ethan's side. But on this particular evening, something was different. Because Ethan was exhausted from a brutal day of training, and his concentration had slipped. And for just a moment, the wall he had built inside his mind came down by a fraction. Veilithra reached through the bond, and for the first time touched the true surface of a human mind. She gasped and pulled back so hard that she physically stumbled. It was like opening a door, expecting an empty room, and finding an ocean. Ethan's mind was not quiet, it was not simple, and it was not empty. And the truth was so far from what she expected, had assumed, that it took her several minutes to stop trembling. Behind that wall of iron will was a storm of consciousness so dense and so layered that it overwhelmed her psychic senses completely. With thoughts running in parallel streams, memories carrying emotional weight so heavy it was almost physical, constant tactical assessment running in the background like a machine that never turned off. And beneath all of it, a depth of feeling so intense that it made Veilithra's own emotional range feel like a puddle compared to his ocean. She understood in that moment why the Ascendari psychic instruments had classified humans as having no measurable psychic signature. Because it was not that humans had too little mental energy to detect. It was that they had so much, compressed so tightly, and churning so wildly, that the instruments simply could not make sense of it. Like trying to hear a single voice in the middle of a hurricane. Ethan had felt her intrusion, and his wall slammed back up immediately, and he turned to look at her with an expression that was half angry and half something else, something almost vulnerable. "Stay out," he said, and his voice was low and tight. "What are you?" Veilithra whispered, and she did not mean it as an insult this time. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, and then something in his face shifted, not softening exactly, but becoming less guarded, as if he had seen something in her expression that he had not expected. "I am a human," he said simply, "and where I come from, that means something, even if your empire does not think so." They stood in silence for a time, and then Ethan did something that surprised them both. He opened the bond a fraction wider, deliberately, and let her feel just a small piece of what he carried inside him every day. Veilithra felt his loneliness, vast and aching, the homesickness for a small blue world so far away, the grief for fallen comrades, protective love for a species that he was beginning to fear would never be safe in a galaxy that did not understand them. And underneath it all, that relentless, stubborn determination that she was starting to realize was not just an Ethan Mercer trait, but a human one. "Your instruments say I am Tier 9, Ethan said quietly. "Your court says I am nothing. And your mother looks at me like I am an embarrassment that might go away if she ignores me long enough." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady and certain. "But I come from a world that tried to kill us with ice and fire and disease, and we are still here. And I have fought things that your empire does not even know exist. And I am telling you now that if you go into those trials thinking your bond is weak, you will die. But if you trust me, if you actually trust me, I will get us both through alive." Velithra looked down at this small battered human who stood barely past her shoulder, and for the first time, she did not see weakness. She saw something that her civilization, with all its power and all its ancient knowledge, had never thought to look for. She saw a survivor. The Ascension Trials were held in a massive ancient structure that orbited a dying red star, and the light that poured through its enormous windows was the color of blood and old fire, and Velithra could feel the heat of it on her skin as she stood at the entrance, alongside Ethan, and looked down the long, dark corridor that led to the first challenge. 3 other heirs stood at their own entrances with their own bonded partners, and every single one of them had been paired with an apex species warrior that made Ethan look like a child standing among giants. Prince Solvan was there with his Draken berserker Hrothgar, a creature of such immense physical power that the floor cracked slightly under his feet when he shifted his weight, and Solvan caught Velithra's eye across the staging area and gave her a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Princess Thyella had bonded with a Thalvori scion whose 4 eyes glowed with telekinetic energy so strong that the air around her shimmered like heat haze, and even Prince Verath, the youngest heir, had a Korvathi battle sage at his side, whose 4 arms were covered in ceremonial scars that told the story of 100 victories. And then there was Ethan, standing at barely 6 feet, with a few new scars from training, and a calm expression on his face that could have meant anything from total confidence to complete indifference. "The trial of strength is first," Velithra said through the bond, because they had been practicing their psychic communication and could now manage simple exchanges without speaking aloud. "I know," Ethan sent back, and his mental voice was steady and clear. "I have been studying the records of every trial of strength for the last 200 years. "And what did you learn?" she asked. "That everyone expects the bigger fighter to win," he replied, "and that is exactly the kind of thinking I can use." The trial of strength took place in a circular arena carved from black stone, and the rules were simple. Each bonded warrior would face another in single combat, and the last one standing would earn the highest marks for their heir. Ethan's first opponent was Hrothgar, Solvan's Draken berserker, and when the 2 of them stepped into the arena, the crowd that had gathered to watch actually laughed. Hrothgar was nearly 12 feet tall, with shoulders as wide as Ethan was long, and his skin was a deep crimson armor plating that could deflect energy weapons, and his arms ended in hands large enough to close around Ethan's entire torso. Ethan looked up at the massive creature and rolled his shoulders and said nothing. The signal to begin sounded, and Hrothgar charged with a roar that shook dust from the ceiling. And he was terrifyingly fast for something so large, and his first strike would have killed Ethan instantly if it had connected. But Ethan was not there. He had moved before Hrothgar even finished. His roar, not away from the Draken but toward him, diving under the massive swing and rolling between Hrothgar's legs to come up behind him. And before the berserker could turn, Ethan had driven his elbow into the back of Hrothgar's knee joint with every ounce of force his body could produce. The joint was one of only 3 weak points on a Draken body, and Ethan knew exactly where all 3 were because he had spent every spare hour of the last 3 weeks studying Draken anatomy. Hrothgar stumbled but did not fall, and he spun with another roar and caught Ethan with a backhand blow that sent the human flying across the arena to crash against the stone wall with a sound that made Velithra flinch through the bond. She felt Ethan's pain spike through their connection. 2 ribs cracked, his left shoulder badly bruised, blood in his mouth, and then she felt something that she was beginning to recognize as uniquely human. The pain did not slow him down. It made him. Ethan got to his feet and spat blood onto the black stone, and his eyes were clear and focused, and already calculating his next move. And Hrothgar charged again, with the confidence of a predator that knew it was stronger, and that confidence was the biggest mistake he had ever made. Ethan fought like nothing the arena had ever seen, not standing his ground like a warrior, but moving constantly, striking weak points and retreating, using the arena walls as springboards, turning Hrothgar's own momentum against him again and again. And every time the Draken hit him, and he was hit many times, Ethan got back up. The crowd stopped laughing after the third time he rose from a blow that should have ended the fight. They went silent after the sixth. Hrothgar was growing frustrated, and his attacks were becoming wild and predictable, exactly as Ethan had planned. And after 8 brutal minutes, the human saw his opening and took it back, using a piece of broken arena wall as a stepping stone, locked his legs around the Draken's thick neck, and applied a chokehold with such precise technique that even Hrothgar's armored skin could not protect the blood vessels beneath. The Draken thrashed and slammed Ethan against walls and floor and pillar, and Vaelithra felt every impact through the bond, like hammer blows against her own body, and she felt Ethan's bones creaking, and his muscles tearing, and his vision going dark at the edges. And through all of it, she felt his grip tighten rather than loosen. Hrothgar's movements slowed, then stuttered, then stopped, and the massive Draken berserker collapsed face first onto the arena floor, with a crash that echoed through the entire structure, and Ethan rolled off of him, and stood on shaking legs, with blood running from his ears and nose, and a look in his eyes that was not triumph, but simple, grim satisfaction. The arena was completely silent. The trial of mind came next, and it required both the heir and their bonded partner to work together through a complex shifting puzzle that rearranged itself every few seconds, testing not just intelligence, but the depth and speed of the psychic bond between partners. "I need to open the bond fully," Vaelithra told Ethan, as they stood before the massive holographic maze that would be their challenge. "Completely. No walls, no barriers, and I need you to do the same." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and she could feel his hesitation through the thin thread of their connection, the instinctive human reluctance to make himself vulnerable in hostile territory. "If I open fully," he said quietly, so that only she could hear, "you are going to feel everything, and I mean everything, and it will not be comfortable for you." "I can handle it," she said, and she believed it because she was an Ascendari royal, and her psychic abilities were among the strongest of hers. She was wrong about the comfortable part. When Ethan lowered his walls, the bond between them did not just open, it exploded, and Vaelithra was hit with the full, unfiltered force of a human mind for the first time, and it nearly drove her to her knees. It was like standing in the center of a star, an overwhelming torrent of thought and emotion and memory and calculation, all happening simultaneously in layers so dense that her mind could not separate them at first. And the sheer emotional intensity of it was staggering, because humans did not just think their feelings, they felt them with their entire bodies, a fusion of mind and physical sensation that the Ascendari had never evolved and could barely comprehend. But then something miraculous happened. Ethan's mind did not just merge with hers, it began to organize the chaos, and she felt his tactical intelligence reach out and wrap around her psychic power like hands around a lens. Abilities were being focused and directed, and split into streams of application that she had never imagined were possible. She could see the puzzle from a dozen angles simultaneously. She could feel the pattern shifts before they happened, and she could project her psychic awareness through the maze with a precision that made her previous abilities feel clumsy by comparison. They solved the trial of mind in 4 minutes, a record that had stood untouched for 300 years. The trial of endurance was last, A 72-hour survival challenge across a hostile environment of extreme temperatures and scarce resources. And this was where Ethan truly came alive. While other bonded pairs struggled, and their apex species champions flagged and faltered under the sustained pressure, Ethan moved through the hostile landscape with a calm efficiency that spoke of deep ancestral knowledge, the kind of knowledge that came from evolving on a planet that had tried to kill humanity with everything it had. He built shelters from available materials in minutes. He found water sources that no one else could detect. He set traps for the dangerous creatures that roamed the trial zone. And he kept them both fed and safe with a relentless competence that never wavered, even as the hours stretched into days. On the final stretch, with the end point within sight, Velithra's body finally gave out, and her legs buckled beneath her, because Ascendari were powerful, but they were not built for sustained physical endurance the way humans were. And she fell to the rocky ground with a gasp of frustration and exhaustion. Ethan stopped and turned back and looked at her. And through the bond she could feel his own exhaustion, his own pain from injuries that had been accumulating for 3 days, and she could feel that he had been running on willpower alone for the last 12 hours. He knelt beside her and put her arm over his shoulders, and lifted her, and he carried her the last 2 miles to the finish line on legs that should not have been able to carry his own weight, let alone hers. They crossed the line, and Velithra looked at this human, this impossible, stubborn human, and the bond between them hummed with something warm and fierce that she did not yet have a name for. Then the alert came through their communication devices, and Velithra's blood went cold. Ethan had gone ahead to scout the extraction zone, and he had been ambushed. And through the bond, she felt the sudden sharp burst of agony that told her he was badly hurt. And beneath the pain, she felt something that frightened her more than anything she had ever encountered. She felt Ethan Mercer get angry. Not the hot, wild rage of a Draken, not the cold cruelty of a wounded predator, but something far more terrifying. A quiet, focused, absolute fury that compressed every ounce of his pain and fear and determination into a single burning point of purpose. When Velithra found him, he was standing over the body of a Korvathi assassin that Prince Sylvan had secretly sent to eliminate him, and the Korvathi was dead, killed with its own broken blade, and Ethan was holding his stomach together with one blood-soaked hand, and his face was pale as paper. "We need to move," he said, and his voice did not waver even slightly. "The trial is not over." Velithra stared at him and felt the bond flood with something she could no longer deny, something that was equal parts awe and terror and a fierce protective warmth that she had never felt for anyone in her entire life. She took his weight against her side, and together they walked toward the finish, and she understood now that the soul flame had not made a mistake. It had given her something far more powerful than a weapon. It had given her a human. Velithra passed the Ascension trials with the highest marks recorded in over a century, and the Imperial Court did not know what to do with that information. For 3 days after their return to Sevrantos, the palace was filled with a strange, tense silence, the kind of silence that falls when powerful people are forced to rethink everything they believed, and Velithra could feel the shift in the way the court looked at Ethan when he walked through the halls. They had stopped laughing, and what replaced the laughter was something much more dangerous. They were afraid. Ethan noticed the change immediately, because humans were very good at reading the body language of other species, a skill that came from sharing a planet with hundreds of predators that would happily eat them. And he mentioned it to Velithra one morning as they sat together in her private chambers reviewing the trial results. "Your people are not looking at me with contempt anymore," said, and his voice was calm, but his eyes were watchful. "They are looking at me the way a herd animal looks at something it does not understand, and that kind of fear makes people do stupid things." He was right, and the stupid things came faster than either of them expected. 1 week after the trials, Empress Selithara summoned Vailithra to the High Council chamber, a vast room of dark stone and floating light panels where the most powerful officials in the Empire made decisions that affected billions of lives. And when Vailithra arrived, she found her mother sitting at the head of the table with an expression that was carefully controlled in a way that meant very bad news. The director of Imperial Intelligence, a sharp-faced Ascendari named Thendrax, who had served the Empire for over a century, stood beside the Empress with a data tablet in his hands and a look on his face that Vailithra had never seen before. It was the look of someone who had just discovered that the ground beneath their feet was not as solid as they had always believed. "We have completed a comprehensive analysis of the species known as humans," Thendrax began, and his voice was steady, but Vailithra could hear the tension underneath it, like a wire pulled too tight. "And the results are significant enough to warrant an emergency session of the High Council." He activated the holographic display at the center of the table, and the room filled with data, charts, timelines, and images, and what they showed made Vailithra's breath catch in her throat. "Humans have been spacefaring for approximately 200 standard years," Thendrax continued, "which by galactic standards is barely a moment. And in that time they have expanded to 14 star systems, established a functioning interstellar government, and built a military force that, while small, is remarkably well organized." He paused, and the next display showed technical schematics that Vailithra recognized as Ascendari technology. "They have also reverse-engineered 3 pieces of Ascendari technology that took our civilization over 4,000 years to develop, including our subspace communication arrays, our atmospheric processing systems, and most alarmingly, our basic shield harmonics." A murmur ran through the council chamber, and Vailithra saw several members lean forward, with narrowed eyes. "How?" asked Councillor Marath, a senior military official whose bioluminescence had gone a deep agitated red. "How does a Tier 9 species reverse-engineer our technology in 2 centuries, when Tier 3 species have failed to do so in 10 times that period?" "That is the central question," Thendrax replied, "and to answer it, we had to examine their home world and their history in detail." The display changed to show a small blue planet orbiting a yellow star, and the data that accompanied it made the council go very quiet. "Earth is what our classification system would designate a Class 12 death world," Thendrax said flatly. "It has extreme temperature variations, tectonic instability, a magnetosphere that periodically weakens and exposes the surface to radiation, an atmosphere that is chemically aggressive, and a biosphere so competitive and violent that the dominant species, humans, had to fight for survival against predators, disease, climate shifts, and each other for their entire evolutionary history." He brought up a timeline of human history, and the room grew quieter still. They survived ice ages that covered half their planet, volcanic events that nearly drove them to extinction, pandemics that killed significant portions of their population multiple times, and through all of this, they did not merely survive, they adapted and grew stronger. The timeline expanded to show the last 10,000 years of human civilization, and even Vailithra, who had spent weeks connected to a human mind through the bond, felt a chill run down her spine. They developed agriculture, industry, nuclear energy, digital computing, genetic engineering, and faster-than-light travel in a span of time that is almost impossibly compressed by galactic standards, Thendrax continued. And the reason for this speed is something our scientists are calling the human acceleration phenomenon. When humans face a crisis, they do not simply endure it. They innovate their way through it at a rate that increases with each generation. "The wars," Councillor Marath said, and it was not a question. "Yes," Thendrax confirmed, Their history contains a nearly unbroken record of internal conflict, and while this initially seems self-destructive, our analysts believe it is actually the engine of their rapid development, because each war forced them to advance their technology and their social structures at an extraordinary pace. He paused again, and the next words he spoke fell into the chamber like stones dropped into still water. Based on their current trajectory, our projections indicate that humans will reach Tier 3 classification within 2 generations, and Tier 1 within 5. And this rate of advancement is completely unprecedented in the 12,000-year history of this empire. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Prince Solvan spoke from his seat at the far end of the table, and his voice was smooth and pleasant and utterly poisonous. "Then the solution is obvious," he said. "We cannot allow a species with this potential to grow unchecked on our border. And I move that the Council authorize a preemptive subjugation of Earth and all human colonies, with a full sterilization protocol if necessary." Vaelithra felt the words hit her like a physical blow, and through the bond, she felt Ethan, who was in their quarters several halls away, go very still as the echo of her shock reached him. "You are talking about genocide," Vaelithra said, and her voice was harder than she had ever heard it. "I am talking about survival," Solvan replied with a calm that made her skin crawl. "This species is a threat to everything we have built, and the longer we wait, the more dangerous they become." Several council members nodded, and Vaelithra could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear she had seen in the halls of the palace, the fear of something they could not classify and could not control. "They are Tier 9, said Councillor Draven, the head of colonial affairs. "They are supposed to be insignificant, and the fact that they are not means our entire classification system has failed to identify a potentially existential threat." "Or it means our classification system is wrong," Vaelithra shot back, "and it has always been wrong, and we have been measuring strength by the wrong standards for thousands of years." The argument raged for hours, and Vaelithra fought for every inch, but she could feel the tide turning against her as fear drove the council towards Solvan's position. And when the session finally ended without a resolution, she walked back to her quarters, feeling as if the ground beneath her empire was beginning to crack. Ethan was waiting for her. He was standing by the window that looked out over the glowing cityscape of Severinthos, and his posture was different from anything she had seen before, rigid and controlled in a way that spoke of enormous internal pressure being held in check by nothing but willpower. "I felt everything through the bond," he said without turning around. "Every word." "Ethan," Vaelithra began. "They want to sterilize my planet," he said, and his voice was quiet, far too quiet. "They want to kill 8 billion people because they are afraid of what we might become." Through the bond, Vaelithra felt something she had never experienced before, and it nearly stopped her heart. It was not rage, though rage was part of it. Was not fear, though fear was buried deep beneath the surface, and it was not hatred, because hatred would have been simpler and easier to understand. What she felt was a cold, absolute resolve, so vast and so deep that it seemed to have no bottom, a determination so fundamental to Ethan's being that it was less like an emotion and more like a law of physics. And it said with perfect clarity that this human would burn down everything he had built here, everything they had built together, everything he was, before he would allow a single hand to be raised against his world. The bond shuddered under the weight of it, and Vaelithra had to brace herself against the wall. Ethan turned to face her, and his brown eyes were steady and clear, and completely without compromise. "If they come for Earth," he said, "I will not be your bondmate anymore. I will be your enemy, and you know what I am capable of." He paused, and the bond hummed with that terrible weight of. "You have seen what one human can do," he continued. "Imagine what 8 billion of us will do when we are fighting for our home." Vaelithra looked at him, and she saw the truth of it as clearly as she had ever seen anything in her life. That this was not a bluff, and this was not bravery, and this was not the defiance of a cornered animal. This was the bedrock of a species that had clawed its way up from nothing on a world that wanted them dead, and had never once stopped fighting for the right to exist. And in that moment, she made her choice. She made it not because it was politically wise, and not because the bond compelled her, and not even because she had come to care for this stubborn, impossible human more than she had ever expected to care for anyone. She made it because it was right. "I will stand before the council tomorrow," she said, "and I will oppose the subjugation order with everything I have. And if they want to destroy your world, they will have to go through me first." Ethan stared at her, and for the first time since she had known him, something in his expression cracked, and through the bond she felt a wave of emotion so raw and so human that it brought tears to her eyes, gratitude and relief, and a fierce blazing affection that he had been holding back behind his walls for weeks, because he had not dared to believe that anyone in this empire would choose to stand beside his people. "Why?" he asked, and his voice was rough. "Because I have been inside your mind," she said, "and I have felt what you feel, and I have seen what you see, and your people are not a threat. They are a miracle, and I will not let my empire destroy a miracle because it is too afraid to understand it." The bond between them blazed with warmth, and for the first time it felt not like a chain or a duty or an accident of fate. It felt like a choice, and choices, Vaelithra was learning, were the most human thing of all. The coup began at dawn. Vaelithra was shaken awake by the sound of explosions echoing through the palace corridors, and before she could even rise from her bed, Ethan was already at the door, with a weapon he had apparently hidden beneath the floor panels weeks ago. Because of course he had. Because humans always prepared for the worst, even when they hoped for the best. "Solve-on," Ethan said, and it was not a question. Through the bond, Vaelithra could feel the chaos spreading across the palace. Hundreds of minds crying out in confusion and fear, and beneath it all, the cold, organized precision of a military operation that had been planned for weeks. "He has the palace guard," Vaelithra said, as she reached out with her psychic awareness and felt the shape of the attack. "And at least 3 legions of the Imperial fleet, and they have my mother." Ethan processed this information in the span of a heartbeat, and Vaelithra felt his mind shift from alertness to a dialogue. Full tactical mode. A transformation so fast and so complete that it was like watching a blade being drawn. "How many people do we have?" he asked. "Kale, the weapons master, and perhaps 40 loyal guards," Vaelithra replied. "Everyone else has either been captured or has joined Solve-on." 40 against 3 legions, Ethan said, and there was no despair in his voice, no hesitation, just the calm, clear focus of a human solving a problem. "I have worked with worse odds." And that, Vaelithra thought, might have been the most human thing she had ever heard. They escaped the palace through a service tunnel that Ethan had mapped during his first week in the building, because he had spent those early days of captivity memorizing every corridor, every maintenance shaft, every structural weakness in the palace, not out of any plan to escape, but simply because that was what a human soldier did. He learned the terrain. Kale and 37 loyal guards met them in the lower infrastructure levels beneath the palace city, and they looked at Ethan with a mixture of hope and uncertainty that Vaelithra understood completely. Because these were Ascendari warriors being asked to follow a human into battle against their own kind. Ethan looked at them and did not give a speech, did not try to inspire them with grand words or promises, because he was not that kind of leader. Instead, he pulled up a holographic map of the palace city on a salvaged data tablet and began to talk. And within 5 minutes in that tunnel, was listening with absolute attention, because what Ethan Mercer was laying out was not a desperate last stand, but a comprehensive tactical campaign. He had studied every piece of Ascendari military doctrine during his weeks in the palace library, and he had identified the fundamental weakness in their approach to warfare. The Ascendari fought with overwhelming force because they had always been the most powerful civilization in the galaxy, and they had never needed to learn anything else. "Your military does not know how to fight an enemy it cannot see," Ethan told them. "It does not know how to handle an opponent that refuses to stand and face them. And it has never in its entire history dealt with guerrilla warfare, because no species has ever been desperate enough or stubborn enough to wage that kind of war against you." He smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. "Humans have been waging guerrilla wars against superior forces since before we discovered metal, and I am going to teach your guards how to fight like the most dangerous thing my world ever produced. A human with nothing to lose and everything to fight for." The campaign that followed lasted 4 days, and it rewrote everything the Ascendari Empire understood about warfare. Ethan turned the Palace City's own infrastructure into a weapon, sabotaging power grids, rerouting communication networks, and creating false signals that sent Solvan's legions chasing ghosts through empty corridors, while his small force struck from the shadows and vanished before the enemy could respond. He set traps that used the Ascendari's own technology against them, rigging doors to seal behind advancing squads and cutting off their retreat, flooding sections with atmospheric gas that was harmless but reduced visibility to nothing, and exploiting the fact that Ascendari bioluminescence made them glow in the dark, which meant they could never hide in the shadows the way his people could. Solvan's commanders were losing their minds. They had 3 legions of the finest soldiers in the galaxy, and they were being systematically dismantled by 40 guards, led by a creature half their size. And every time they adapted to one tactic, Ethan had already moved on to the next, because that was the human way, to change and adapt and overcome faster than the enemy could keep up. Fully opened bond, Velithra and Ethan had become something neither species had ever seen before, a perfect fusion of Ascendari psychic power and human tactical genius. Velithra could project her awareness across the entire battlefield because Ethan's mind acted as a lens that focused and amplified her abilities in ways she had never dreamed possible, splitting her consciousness into dozens of streams that could each operate independently. And through this network, she could see every enemy movement, feel every shift in the battle, and relay information to their forces with instant precision. It was as if she had become the nervous system of an entire army, and Ethan was the brain directing it all. On the 4th day they fought their way to the throne room. The doors were sealed with psychic locks that should have been impenetrable, but Velithra channeled her power through the bond, and Ethan shaped it with his mind into a focused beam of force so precise that it cut through the locks like a blade through water. The throne room was vast and dark, lit only by the red emergency lighting and the glow of the soul flame which still burned at its center, undimmed and eternal. And standing before the throne was Prince Solvan with his new bonded partner, a Thalvori scion of enormous power whose 4 eyes blazed with telekinetic energy. Solvan looked at them, and his face twisted with a rage that went beyond politics into something deeply personal. "A human," he spat. "You have torn my empire apart for a human." "I have torn your coup apart for what is right," Velithra replied, and beside her Ethan said nothing because he did not need to, because the bond between them was blazing with shared purpose and shared strength, and there were no words that could add to what they already were together. The battle was devastating. Solvan's Thalvori unleashed waves of telekinetic force that cracked the stone pillars, shattered the ancient windows, and Solvan himself wielded psychic abilities that were terrifyingly strong, enhanced by a bond with a Tier 1 species exactly as tradition demanded. But Velithra and Ethan fought as one being, 2 minds fused through a bond that had been forged not in ceremony, but in blood and trust, and something that was beginning to feel like love. And they moved together with a synchronization so perfect that every attack they made was from 2 directions at once, and every defense covered both of them simultaneously. Ethan took hits that would have killed any other species 3 times over. Telekinetic blasts that cracked his bones and tore his skin. And each time he absorbed the pain, and stayed on his feet through nothing but the sheer impossibility of human willpower. And each second he endured bought Velithra another opening. Then Solvon struck with everything he had, a concentrated beam of psychic energy aimed directly at Ethan's mind. Bond screamed as the attack tore through Ethan's defenses and reached for the core of who he was. Velithra felt him dying. She felt the light of his mind flickering, felt his body shutting down, felt the cold creeping in at the edges of his consciousness, and for one terrible moment, the Bond went silent. And then she felt something impossible. She felt Ethan Mercer, on the very edge of death, reach down into the deepest part of himself, and find something there that no psychic instrument could measure, and no species classification could define. The raw, stubborn refusal of a human being to die when there was still someone depending on him. His mind blazed back to life like a star being born, and the Bond did not just reconnect, it detonated. The psychic energy that erupted through their connection was unlike anything in recorded Ascendari history, fueled not by training or genetics or ancient power, but by the most human force in existence, unwillingness to abandon someone you love. Velithra channeled the supernova of power and directed it at Solvon, with the precision that only her bond with Ethan could provide. And the blast shattered his psychic network and threw him across the throne room to crash against the far wall, where he slumped and did not rise. The Falvori collapsed as the backlash of Solvon's broken bond tore through her, and the coup was over. In the silence that followed, Ethan fell to his knees, and Velithra caught him before he hit the ground, and she held this small, battered, impossible human in her arms, and felt through the bond that he was alive, damaged and exhausted beyond anything she could comprehend, but alive and still fighting, because that was what humans did. "You came back," she whispered. "I was not finished yet," he replied, and even now, even broken and bleeding on the throne room floor, there was the ghost of a smile on his face. Thrown 3 days later, in a ceremony that was nothing like the one that had been planned for her. Because the empire she inherited was not the same empire it had been a month ago. Her first act as Empress was to abolish the species classification system that had ranked the galaxy's peoples like animals. And her second act was to extend a formal alliance to Earth, not as a superior power offering protection to a lesser species, but as an equal, recognizing an equal. The galaxy watched with a mixture of awe and nervousness as humanity stepped onto the galactic stage, no longer a Tier 9 curiosity to be ignored, but the bonded partner of the most powerful empire in known space. At the formal reception that followed the coronation, a delegation of alien ambassadors approached Ethan with the cautious body language of creatures who had recently learned that the small, quiet species they had dismissed was anything but small and quiet. "What do humans want?" one of them asked, and it was a question that carried the weight of a galaxy's future behind it. "Now that you have the ear of the Empress." Ethan looked at them with those steady brown eyes that had seen the inside of a prison cell, and a bonding ceremony, and a trial arena, and a war, and had never once looked away from any of it. "We want what we have always wanted," he said. "To survive, to protect our own, and to see what is out there." He paused, and the room hung on his silence. "You should be glad that is all we want." Behind him, Velithra felt the bond hum with warmth and amusement, and beneath it all, that vast, quiet, inexhaustible strength that she had once been foolish enough to mistake for weakness. She had gone into the bonding ceremony expecting a weapon, and had been given something so much better. She had been given a partner. The Empress and her human faced the galaxy together, and the galaxy looked back, and for the first time in 12,000 years, It wondered if perhaps it had been measuring strength wrong all along.